I've been thinking a lot lately about how the simple act of walking through an airport has changed. It's not just about remembering your ID anymore. It's about navigating a landscape that shifts under your feet, sometimes without any warning at all. I was standing in a security line at Chicago O'Hare just last month, watching a gentleman who had to be in his late 70s get pulled aside. He was calm, he was polite, he had his boarding pass folded neatly in his hand. But the officer was shaking his head, and I could see the confusion on the older man's face starting to turn into something else. Frustration, maybe a little embarrassment. And I thought to myself, we spend so much time talking about what you can bring in your carry-on, but we hardly ever talk about the invisible rules, the ones that aren't printed on the TSA website, the ones that seem to specifically target the generation that built the modern travel industry. So let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. Have you, or someone you're traveling with who's over 70, ever been stopped at a security checkpoint for a reason that made absolutely no sense to you? Not for a water bottle or a pair of scissors, but for something about you personally, your age, your mobility, or just the way you looked to the officer that day. I want you to hold on to that thought. And when you get a moment, drop it in the comments, because I have a feeling some of the stories I'm about to share are going to hit really close to home. And I'd love to hear how your experience lines up with what's actually happening out there. Here's the thing about airport security in 2026. It's not just about the banned items list anymore. That list is almost the easy part. You can memorize it, you can print it out, you can pack your bags the night before and know with reasonable certainty that you're not going to be the person holding up the line because of a forgotten pocket knife. But what's happening now, especially for travelers over 70, is something much more nuanced and, frankly, much more personal. We're seeing a shift in enforcement that feels less like standard procedure and more like a series of judgment calls. And judgment calls, as you know, are only as good as the person making them at that exact second. Let's start with the obvious stuff because we have to build a foundation here. We all know the basics. You can't bring a gun, you can't bring explosives, you can't bring a sword cane, even if it's a family heirloom. But the rules are getting tighter in ways that feel targeted. For example, the rules around medical devices and medications have always been a gray area, but recently they've become a major stumbling block for older travelers. I'm talking about things that seem perfectly innocent. You have a CPAP machine for sleep apnea. That's fine. You take it out, you put it in a bin, it goes through the X-ray. But what about the distilled water you need to run it when you get to your hotel? You can't bring a gallon of it through security, obviously, but the rules about buying it after the checkpoint are also changing. Some airports have removed those convenience stores from certain concourses during renovation, and suddenly you're stuck. But it goes deeper than that. I was talking to a retired couple from Florida last year, both in their mid-70s, and they told me a story that stopped me cold. They were flying out of Fort Lauderdale, a place that sees more senior travelers in a day than most airports see in a week. The wife has a titanium hip replacement. She's had it for years. She knows the drill. She tells the officer before she goes through the advanced imaging scanner. But this time the officer waved her through anyway. The machine alarmed, obviously, because of the metal. So they pull her aside for a pat-down. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The officer performing the pat-down, instead of being the usual quick and professional process, became an interrogation. She kept asking why the wife didn't mention the hip replacement. The wife said, "I did," I told the first officer. The officer doing the pat-down said, "Well, I don't have a record of that." And then she started asking if the wife had any other internal devices that could be considered suspicious. The husband, watching this, felt his blood pressure spike. He wasn't worried about the pat-down, he was worried about the implication. The officer was treating his wife's medical history as if it were a potential threat. This is the new reality. It's not just about what you're carrying, it's about how your body itself is perceived by a system that is increasingly automated and increasingly suspicious of anything that deviates from a perfect, clean scan. And for people over 70, whose bodies are more likely to have these anomalies, the joint replacements, the pacemakers, the surgical screws, the portacaths, you become a walking exception to the rule. And exceptions, by their nature, draw scrutiny. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. It's the stuff you are allowed to bring, but that will absolutely get you pulled out of line and questioned. This is where the allowed versus forbids gets really tricky. You are allowed to bring food. That's a big one for seniors who like to travel with snacks for medical reasons, like glucose tablets or protein bars. But you have to understand the optics. If you bring a homemade sandwich wrapped in tinfoil, that sandwich is going to look like a dense, organic mass on the X-ray screen. The officer sees something that isn't a phone, isn't a wallet, isn't a standard shape. They have to check it. So now you're standing there while someone unwraps your turkey on rye, and you feel like you're being treated like a criminal. You aren't. They're just doing their job. But the emotional toll that takes on someone who remembers a time when you could walk to the gate and meet your loved ones right at the door, that's significant. Let's talk about liquids. Everyone knows the 3-1-1 rule. 3.4 ounces, 1 quart-sized bag, 1 bag per person. But for seniors, this rule clashes directly with reality. How many people over 70 take prescription medications that are liquids? How many use inhalers? How many carry liquid gels for arthritis pain? These items are exempt from the 3-1-1 rule, but you have to declare them. You have to separate them. And if you don't, if you just leave them in your bag hoping they'll blend in, you are inviting a bag search. And a bag search at a busy checkpoint is not a private affair. It's happening in the middle of a concourse with hundreds of people watching. That loss of dignity, that feeling of being on display, is a real consequence that isn't listed in any TSA regulation. And then there's the new technology. We're seeing more and more airports roll out credential authentication technology, or CAT scanners. These are the machines where you put your ID in, and it scans it and verifies you against your flight reservation. It sounds efficient, and it is for most people. But here's the hidden wrinkle. If you're traveling with someone else and you hand the officer both IDs, they sometimes have to process them separately. And if the system flags an ID for any reason, maybe it's an older passport, maybe the photo doesn't quite match the scan, you get moved to a secondary screening area. For a senior with mobility issues, that secondary area might be a long walk from the checkpoint. It might mean standing for an extra 15 minutes. It might mean missing your connection. The technology is designed to speed things up, but for the outliers, it actually creates a bottleneck. Now I have to get into something that might make some people uncomfortable. It's the behavioral detection aspect. The TSA has trained officers who look for behavioral indicators of stress or deception. They watch for people who look confused, who are sweating, who are avoiding eye contact, or who are, conversely, being overly friendly. Here's the problem. A lot of those behaviors are also symptoms of aging. Confusion in a large, noisy airport? Common. Sweating because of medication or menopause? Common. Avoiding eye contact because of vision problems or social anxiety? Common. Being overly friendly because you're nervous about flying for the first time in 10 years? Also common. So what we have is a system where the very signs of being an older, potentially anxious traveler can be misinterpreted as signs of malicious intent. That's a recipe for friction. I remember reading a report about a woman in her 80s who was stopped because she was wandering aimlessly near the checkpoint. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was looking for the restroom, which had been moved since her last trip. She was detained for questioning for 20 minutes while her family waited on the other side, frantic. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just lost. But in the post-9/11 world, being lost in an airport can look like reconnaissance to an overzealous observer. That's the world we live in. And if you're over 70, you need to be aware that your actions, however innocent, are being watched and interpreted through a lens of security. So, what are they forbidding? Well, let's get into the weeds on some specific items that trip up seniors all the time. First, tools. This is a huge one. A lot of men over a certain age carry a multi-tool on their keychain. It's a habit. It's a pocket knife with a screwdriver and maybe a pair of pliers. You cannot bring it through security. It doesn't matter if the blade is smaller than your pinky. If it has a blade, it's a knife, and it's not allowed. I see this every single time I fly. Someone in their 60s or 70s walks up, puts their keys in the bin, and the officer spots the little leather man. Then comes the decision. You can go back to the ticket counter and check your bag, if you have one. You can throw it away, or you can mail it to yourself if the airport has one of those mailing kiosks, which most don't anymore. So it's gone. That little tool they've had for 30 years, trashed because they forgot to take it off the keyring. It breaks my heart every time. Then there's sporting goods. You'd be surprised how many people try to bring golf clubs or fishing rods as carry-on. They think, well, it's just a rod, it's not dangerous. But the rules are clear. Sporting goods that can be used as a club are generally forbidden in the cabin. They need to be checked. For a senior on a fishing trip to Alaska, showing up at the gate with a rod tube and being told you can't take it on is a disaster. You're either missing your flight or leaving your gear behind. And let's talk about lighters. You are allowed to bring one disposable lighter in your carry-on. That's a fact. But you are not allowed to bring torch lighters, the kind with a focused flame or lighter fluid. So if you're a smoker, you might think, I'll just bring my nice Zippo. A standard Zippo with absorbent material and a wick is actually allowed. But if you've modified it, or if it's a butane torch style, it's coming out. And the officer isn't going to give you a lecture on the nuances. They're just going to take it. Now, here's a section that I think is critically important for anyone over 70 to understand. It's not about what you pack, it's about how you move through the process. The physical act of going through security has become an obstacle course. You have to lift your carry-on onto the belt. You have to take off your shoes, your belt, your jacket. You have to empty your pockets. You have to walk through the scanner with your hands up. For someone with arthritis, back pain, or balance issues, this is not just inconvenient. It's physically painful and potentially dangerous. I've seen seniors stumble stepping out of their shoes. I've seen them struggle to lift a heavy bag. I've seen them freeze in the scanner because they can't hold the required position. And the TSA does have procedures for this. You can request a modified screening. You can ask for a private screening. You can request to remain seated. But here's the catch. You have to ask. And asking, for a generation that was raised to be polite, not to make a fuss, and to follow the rules, is incredibly difficult. They don't want to be that person. They don't want to hold up the line, so they try to muscle through, and they end up hurting themselves or causing a scene anyway. My advice, and I can't stress this enough, is to speak up before you get to the conveyor belt. Tell the officer, I have a bad back, I can't lift my bag, or I have a knee replacement, can I sit down for the pat-down? They will accommodate you. It might take an extra minute, but it beats the alternative. We also have to talk about the medications themselves. The rules say you can bring your pills in any form, in any quantity, as long as they're screened. But the practical reality is that if you bring a 3-month supply of pills in unmarked bottles or in a weekly pill organizer, you are inviting questions. The TSA recommends keeping medications in their original prescription bottles. Why? Because it removes the ambiguity. If an officer sees a bottle with your name, the drug name, and a pharmacy label, it's a non-issue. If they see a baggie full of white tablets, they have to investigate. And while they're investigating, you're waiting. For a senior on a tight connection, that wait could be the difference between making your flight and sleeping in the terminal. Now, I want to get into something that is absolutely forbidden, but that I see attempted constantly, and that's the gift rule. You cannot bring someone else's prescription medication. It doesn't matter if it's your spouse's blood pressure pill and you accidentally grabbed the wrong bottle. It doesn't matter if it's your sister's painkiller that she asked you to bring to her. If the name on the bottle doesn't match the name on your boarding pass, you are in possession of a controlled substance without a prescription. That's a federal offense. I've seen people detained for this. I've seen them miss flights and face fines. It is not worth it. Double-check your bags. Make sure every pill bottle has your name on it. And while we're on the subject of forbids, let's talk about self-defense items. This is a big one for seniors who might be traveling to unfamiliar cities and feel vulnerable. Pepper spray is generally forbidden in carry-on luggage. Some small canisters are allowed in checked bags, but you have to check the specific rules of the airline and the destination, because some states ban it entirely. Tasers and stun guns are absolutely forbidden in carry-on. You cannot bring them. If you feel you need protection, you need to research legal options at your destination and purchase them there. Do not try to bring it from home. I also want to touch on the emotional support animal rules, because this affects a lot of older travelers. The rules changed a few years ago. Airlines are no longer required to recognize emotional support animals as service animals. Only trained service dogs are granted special access. So if you have a little dog that helps you feel calm, it's now considered a pet. That means it has to fly in a carrier that fits under the seat, and you have to pay a pet fee. I've seen seniors at the check-in counter crying because they didn't know the rules changed and they can't afford the fee or they don't have the right carrier. It's a heartbreaking scene, and it's completely avoidable if you check the airline's pet policy before you book. Now, let's pivot back to the technology side. The advanced imaging technology scanners, the ones that show a generic outline of your body and highlight areas of concern, are supposed to make the process more private. But for someone with a medical device, they are a source of constant anxiety. The machine might highlight your hip, your knee, or your chest. When it does, the officer has to resolve the alarm. That usually means a pat-down. And the pat-down, while professional, is invasive. They use the back of their hands. They check sensitive areas. For someone who is modest, or who has trauma in their past, or who simply doesn't want to be touched by a stranger, this is a horrible experience. The TSA does offer the option to opt out of the scanner and request a pat-down instead. But again, you have to ask. And if you opt out, you're often waiting for a same-gender officer, which can add time. I was speaking with a travel nurse who specializes in geriatric care, and she told me something fascinating. She said that the stress of the security checkpoint can actually trigger medical events in vulnerable seniors. The anxiety, the standing, the heat, the noise. It can raise blood pressure, trigger angina, or cause a panic attack. She's seen it happen. She recommends that her patients request a wheelchair assistant, not because they can't walk, but because it streamlines the process and reduces stress. The wheelchair gets you to the front of the line, and you're screened separately, often in a more relaxed manner. It's a hack, essentially, and it's a brilliant one. If you're over 70 and worried about the chaos of the checkpoint, request the wheelchair service. You don't have to be an invalid to use it. It's a tool. Now let's talk about something that is allowed, but that I think you should avoid. And that's wrapping gifts. If you're traveling during the holidays and you have wrapped presents in your carry-on, the TSA may need to unwrap them to inspect them. So that beautifully wrapped box for your granddaughter, it might get torn open on the inspection table. If you're flying with gifts, wait to wrap them until you get to your destination. Or use gift bags with tissue paper that are easy to peek into and recover. Another thing that's allowed but problematic, large electronics. You can bring a laptop, a tablet, an e-reader, but you have to take them out of your bag and put them in a separate bin. For someone with dexterity issues, wrestling a laptop out of a tightly packed bag while trying to keep the line moving is stressful. My advice is to pack your electronics on top, in an easy-to-access pocket. Make it as simple as possible for yourself. We also have to address the issue of cash and jewelry. There is no limit to how much cash you can bring through security. It's not illegal. But if you're carrying a large amount, tens of thousands of dollars, you will be questioned. The TSA doesn't care about cash per se, but they will notify local law enforcement if they find a suspicious amount. And then you have to explain where it came from and where it's going. For a senior who just sold a car and is carrying the proceeds to deposit at their destination, this can be a terrifying encounter. If you must carry large sums of cash, declare it to the officer before you go through. It won't stop the questions, but it might make the process less confrontational. Let's get into the forbidden items that people genuinely forget. Tools over 7 inches, even if they're not sharp. A screwdriver that's 8 inches long? Forbidden. A hammer? Definitely forbidden. A crowbar? Absolutely not. I saw a guy try to bring a small hatchet in his carry-on once. He said he used it for camping. The officer looked at him like he had 3 heads. That's a weapon. It's going in the trash. And then there's the question of batteries. Loose lithium batteries are forbidden in checked luggage. They have to be in your carry-on, but there are limits. You can't bring a huge industrial-sized battery. Spare batteries, the kind for your camera or your phone, need to have the terminals taped over to prevent short-circuiting. If you just throw them loose in your bag and they touch a set of keys, they can spark. It's a fire risk. The TSA will pull them out and make you secure them properly. Now, I want to circle back to the human element, because that's really what this is all about. The rules are the rules, but the enforcement is human, and humans have good days and bad days. If you encounter an officer who is being unreasonable, your best bet is to stay calm and ask for a supervisor. Do not argue. Do not raise your voice. In the post-9/11 security environment, being argumentative is a quick way to get yourself escorted out of the airport. You have rights, but you don't have the right to argue at the checkpoint. Ask for a supervisor politely. Explain your situation calmly. Most of the time, the supervisor will sort it out. I also want to talk about the TSA PreCheck program. If you are over 70 and you fly more than once a year, you need to get TSA PreCheck. It costs money and it requires an in-person interview, but it is worth its weight in gold. With PreCheck, you don't have to take off your shoes, your belt, or your light jacket. You can leave your laptop in your bag. You can leave your 311 liquids in your bag. It speeds up the process dramatically and reduces the physical demands of the screening. There's also a program called Clear, which uses biometrics to verify your identity and skip the ID check line. It's even faster, but it's a subscription service. For seniors, any tool that reduces time on your feet and reduces handling of your belongings is a win. But here's a warning about PreCheck. It doesn't guarantee you won't be searched. You can still be randomly selected for additional screening, and if you set off the metal detector, you'll still get a pat-down. It's not a magic wand. It's just a way to make the standard process easier. Let's talk about international travel for a moment, because the rules change when you're coming back into the U.S. You go through U.S. Customs and Border Protection before you recheck your bags and go through security again at your point of entry. This is where things get really complicated for seniors. After a long international flight, you're tired, you're disoriented, and you have to go through the entire security process again. And the customs officers are not TSA. They are law enforcement officers with a different mandate. They can ask you questions about your trip, about what you bought, about how how much money you spent. If you're carrying medication, they might ask to see it. If you're carrying food items from abroad like cheese or fruit, they will confiscate them. The rules about bringing agricultural products into the U.S. are strict. You cannot bring fresh fruit, vegetables, or meats from most countries. I've seen seniors cry over a piece of cheese they bought in France, not knowing they couldn't bring it home. So, what is the takeaway here? It's not just a list of do's and don'ts, it's a mindset. If you're over 70 or if you're traveling with someone who is, you have to approach the airport with a strategy. You have to prepare for the physical demands. You have to prepare for the potential confusion. You have to prepare for the possibility that you will be singled out, not because you did anything wrong, but because you look like someone who might need extra scrutiny, or because your medical history is visible to a machine. The TSA's mission is security. That's it. They aren't there to make you comfortable. They aren't there to make you feel dignified. They are there to prevent another attack. And in pursuit of that mission, they will occasionally inconvenience, frustrate, and embarrass innocent people. That's the trade-off we've accepted as a society. But for seniors, the cost of that trade-off is often higher. I think about that man I saw at O'Hare, the one getting pulled aside. I never found out what happened to him. I hope he made his flight. I hope the officer was kind. I hope he didn't let the experience ruin his trip. Because that's the thing about flying. It's supposed to be the beginning of an adventure, not an ordeal. And when the security checkpoint becomes an ordeal, it taints everything that follows. So, let me ask you again. Have you or someone you know over 70 had a strange or difficult experience at a TSA checkpoint? What happened? How did it make you feel? I really want to know because these stories matter. They remind us that behind every regulation, behind every scanner, behind every pat-down, there's a human being trying to get somewhere. And sometimes, the system forgets that. I've shared a lot here, but honestly, we've only scratched the surface. The rules change constantly. The technology evolves. The interpretations shift. The best thing you can do is stay informed, be patient, and advocate for yourself and your loved ones. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And don't be afraid to speak up if something feels wrong. The airport is a confusing place, but you don't have to navigate it alone. Keep your wits about you, keep your ID handy, and keep your sense of humor if you can. Because sometimes, that's all you have left when they're unwrapping your sandwich and asking about your hip replacement at 6 in the morning. Safe travels, everyone. I'll see you in the comments.